By far, the biggest new feature of Cubase 7.5 is track versions. And track versions allow you to keep multiple different versions of different performances and recordings all inside of one single track. That means that you won't have to be creating either a whole bunch of new comping lanes whenever you want to add additional types of performances to one track. And it also means you won't have to be adding more and more and more tracks and then muting the previous versions and soloing or enabling the new versions for you to keep all of those versions together. Now you can keep all of those different versions inside of track versions on one track. Now, in this tutorial, I'm going to show you the concepts of track versions, and a little bit later on, I'll show you how to use track versions both for recording and for editing. But right now, let's just get familiar with the concepts. First, there are two different ways to access track versions. The first way is from the individual track itself. On this audio track, if I come to the very end of the track name, you'll see a little drop-down box. When you click on that little drop-down box, you can get to some of the track version options, or you can even select a different track version if you have additional versions recorded onto that track. So from here, we could either create a new version or duplicate a version that already exists. If I had some other track versions in here, I could also rename, delete those versions, or select tracks with the same version ID. But what I'm going to do now is come over to the inspector because you'll notice that it has a new track versions tab. When you click on that tab, it'll give you a list of all of the different names and versions of your track versions along with the ID, which you use when you're selecting track versions with the same ID. Now let's say that we wanted to record a new performance onto that track with a new track version. I could either go to that little drop-down box and choose New Version, or the keyboard shortcut for a new track version is Shift along with Control or Command N, or you could come to the Track Versions tab and click on New Version here. That will make two different versions. You'll always have one track version on any track, but if you have multiple versions, they'll both show up right here. And then if I wanted to give each of these versions a different name, for example, I could call this one Gray Bass, and I could call this one Wood Bass. Then you'll notice that since I do have a new track version in my list, the light on the Track Versions tab has lit up, indicating that I have multiple track versions on that track. So now I can choose the different track versions for that track in two different ways, either from the Track Versions tab, just by clicking on the name of the desired track version, or I could also come to the track itself and choose each of those different track versions right there. Now let me talk about what kinds of tracks have track versions. This is an audio track, and I already have some audio on there, so there's my first track version. But you can also use track versions on instrument tracks or MIDI tracks, and those all work the exact same way as audio tracks. Each one of those tracks records either a MIDI event or audio events, so they use track versions in the exact same way. But there are three more types of tracks that allow you to use track versions in really cool ways. Let's talk about the first one, which is the chord track. Since chord tracks now have track versions, you could actually have different chord progressions inside of the same project. You see, previous versions of Cubase did not have track versions, so you could only have one chord track, meaning that you'd have to save different versions of the same project with different chord tracks if you wanted to listen to them using different chord progressions. For example, if I wanted to add another chord track right now, I can't do it because this project already contains a chord track. But now if I wanted to try different chord progressions, I can just create a new track version and try different chord progressions through the same project. The same thing is true of the tempo track. So let's add a tempo track, and tempo tracks were the same way. Before, if you tried to add a different tempo track for different tempo maps of the same project, you'd have to save two projects because you don't have the ability to use multiple tempo tracks inside of one project. But now with Cubase 7.5, you can have different tempo maps inside of the exact same projects by using the track versions. And the last thing that you can use is the signature track. And again, this worked the same way as tempo and chord tracks. You could only have one. But with track versions, you could have different time signatures inside of one single project. So those are the concepts of track versions, and next I'm going to show you how to use track versions during recording.